In this video, I am going to cover a common question I'm asked, which is how do you measure a skateboard? And specifically, what I'm going to do is go over how to measure a skateboard using the parametric way of defining a skateboard with SkateCAD, which is the software on the opensourceboards.com website. So let's jump in. The first thing you're going to need if you're going to follow along or do this on your own is measurement devices. Actually, I don't know if you'll need much else other than the measurement devices for measuring your board. You may want a computer so you can look at the SkateCAD specs. So measurement devices, I have a tape measure, I have calipers, nothing fancy here. I have a carpenter square. This could be handy for some things. And I have some swing arm protractors and some radius gauges. And I'll explain more about all these different types of measuring devices as we use them. The other thing I wanted to mention was that I've got SkateCAD open here, so I'm just going to go down the line of parameters. SkateCAD and the parametric way of defining a board in SkateCAD is not the only way to define a skateboard. So I'm going to outline, as I go through this, some of the different ways in which skateboards might be shaped, where the SkateCAD specs might be a little different, or where you'd see some differences with SkateCAD specs and maybe what a board you have has. So first dimension, first parameter in SkateCAD is the width. And if you've been skating, that's probably the one of the dimensions you definitely know how to measure. Here's a board. This is the board I'm going to be measuring. You can ignore this little thing here. This is a board that I have hung on the wall, and I didn't take the hanger off. So we're just going to ignore that. That's not some sort of fancy measuring assistive tool in any way. So width is just the widest point, the widest distance of your board. So find the widest section of your board. This is a standard popsicle, so the rails, I'm going to refer to the rails a bit. The rails are the edges of your board. Nose is the front of the board, tail is the back of the board. So the width is the distance between the widest point on the rails of your boards, on your board. And this board is 8.5 inches wide. You don't want to lay the ruler down or the tape measure down for this, because when you go along a curve, it's going to make the dimensions slightly longer. So it's just straight across width. You can do it with a ruler or yardstick too. The next dimension in SkateCAD, or parameter in SkateCAD, is wheelbase. Oh, and I'll mention also what these parameters affect. So with width, the smaller the board, the lighter it is, the more maneuverable it is. The less wide the board is, the more maneuverable it is and the lighter it is. The wider the board is, the more stable it feels. And I used to think that wider boards were harder to flip, and they are a little bit harder to flip, but I don't think they're as hard to flip as you may think they are. Sometimes that extra width can help provide leverage for flipping your board easier. So width basically affects the size of your board, which is the trade-off between stability and control. Less control you have, the more stable the board is. The more stable the board is, less control you have. Okay, wheelbase is next, and that is the distance between the centers of the innermost truck holes. When you're measuring sometimes with a ruler or measuring tape, the ends aren't always trustworthy or reliable. Sometimes the ends don't start at 0. And other times, like if I have this tape measure and it's got this little hook feature on it, it's hard to measure easily with the angles of everything. So what I like to do is start at another number. So I'm going to start at 10, line that up with the center of this truck hole, and go to the center of the other truck hole, and I read 24.5, so I have to subtract 10 because I started at the 10 and not the 0. So this board has a wheelbase of 14.5 inches. The bigger your wheelbase is, the more stable your board will be, and also the more flexible it can potentially be. Like if you have a really long longboard, a 7-ply board that has a 14.5-inch wheelbase will probably feel pretty stiff for most people, but a 7-ply board with a 30-inch wheelbase is going to have a pretty good amount of flex. That was wheelbase. Next, we've got nose length and tail length. These are measured the same exact way. The only difference is whether you're measuring at the nose or the front of your board or the tail of your board. I've got the nose right here. I've also got the tail here, but I was at the nose first. You hold your measuring device straight out, so the device is parallel with the base of the board. And you want to look straight down, directly over the outermost truck holes, because you're measuring from the tip of the board to the center of the outside truck holes, not the inner truck holes like you did with wheelbase. And if I look straight down, directly above the truck holes, I get 6 3/4 of an inch. Now, if you lay the measuring tape flat, that can throw off your dimensions. And some people do measure it this way, and I think some brands even measure it this way, so it can be a little confusing. The reason I don't like to measure that way is because that doesn't account for the angle of the kick and the curvature of the kick shape. So this distance from here to here, I think, to me, it made a little bit more sense to track that rather than the overall length of the curved feature of the board. And the longer your nose or tail length is, the mellower your pop angle is. And the pop angle is the angle your board makes with the ground when the nose or tail hits. The steeper your pop angle, generally the more pop you have. That definitely that's not infinite, of course, because if you have a pop angle like that, it's not going to be that easy to pop. But generally speaking, the trade-off is you have a little bit more pop as you increase that angle, but the trade-off is that you can't have as much finesse or be as responsive when you have a steep angle. If you're looking for a quicker pop, that happens when you have a mellower angle. Also, not an angle, when you have a mellower angle, which is the result of a longer nose or tail length. It's also nice to have a slightly longer length if you're doing like nose and tail slides. It's nice to have a good foot placement and not be falling off the board. Okay, nose and tail length are covered. Let's go on to concave drop. The concave drop is the vertical distance between or from the center of your concave to the rail of your board. So it's how high in this vertical direction is this point above this point. The way we measure this is using two things. So I usually like to use a straight edge like this. Basically, a straight edge is any device or tool that has a straight edge. And then I like the calipers for this because you could do this nifty little trick where you open the calipers so you have the bottom of the calipers sticking out, and then set it in the center. And I'll do this way so you can kind of see what I'm doing here, but I can't see. You're gonna push the calipers down until this base piece of the calipers matches up with the base of your straight edge. So this piece right here is on the board. This piece is on the, or at the same level as the base of the straight edge. And this tells me, I actually have to do it from my side so I can see, get an accurate reading here, although I guess it really doesn't matter for this video. This has a 1/2 inch concave drop. And you don't need calipers for this. You can just use a ruler and go like that. That works too. One thing that you might see that is specific to SkateCAD, that's not specific to every skateboard, is the type of concave. So SkateCAD only shows you a radial concave at this time. A radial concave basically means that this concave is shaped as a radial arc. The other types of concave that exist are tub concave, which has more of a flat section and then it slants up on the sides, and progressive concave, which is like a combination of radial and tub, where it's relatively flat in the center and then it progressively curves up. And there's also W concave, and where there's like a bump in the middle. There's flat boards with no concave. There might be boards with convex. I've not seen one. Essentially what that means is that you might design a board with a 1/2 inch drop of radial concave, and that will feel different than a board with a 1/2 inch drop of progressive concave or tub concave, just because of the curvature and the way it's shaped. So just something to keep in mind. The more concave you have, the stiffer the board can become, because it's concave adds a little bit of stiffness to the board. The more leverage you have for carving, for flipping the board, and the more clearance you have for your wheels when you turn, helps prevent wheel bite a little bit. And if you have less concave, you have a more flexible board or a more comfortable surface for doing footwork tricks, if you prefer a flat surface for doing footwork. The next parameter, or the next two parameters, are kicknose and kicktail angle. These are the angles of your kicknose and kicktail, and that angle is measured from the midsection of your board. So this part of your board is parallel with the ground, and the angle that the board ultimately comes up at the nose and tail. And the way to measure this is with a swing arm protractor like these. And I'm going to make these available on the website, and I'll try and link to these in the description of this video. You don't have to use these ones, and I'll include the files so you can download them, and if you have a 3D printer or a laser cutter or access to that, you can make these yourself. But I think these are relatively cheap. The nice thing about these is I think they're a little bit longer than a typical swing arm protractor. Anyways, basically put the base on the base of the board, and then you do kind of need a little bit of room to hang off here, so I gotta hang off the table a little bit. And then swing the arm down so it's parallel or pressed up against the kick of the board. And then once you've got that there, you can look at your angle. I realize this is probably very hard for you to see, but it does say 21 degrees, and this is supposed to have a 21-degree kicktail. So that is great. That works out exactly as I expected and hoped that it would. You can do this without a protractor. You can take a picture of your board sideways and try and superimpose it with a SkateCAD screenshot and then tweak the SkateCAD parameters to try and match the tail as much as possible. But this is the easy way of doing this. The steeper your nose and tail, the steeper your pop angle. And I mentioned that earlier, how that affects your skating. Also, if you have like a steeper nose, I believe that tends to help you pop up your ollies a little bit higher and balance out your board, gives you a bit more leverage for kind of pushing your board back down and pulling it up. So pulling it up with an ollie and then like pushing it back down. The next set of parameters are the nose and tail radii. So the radius of the kicknose or kicktail is the curvature here. Basically, how quickly does the board go from flat or parallel with the ground to its full angle? And the way I measure this, or the easiest way to measure this, is with some radius gauges. This is also something I will link to. I'll just include a PDF, and you can basically print out a sheet like this with several different radiuses on it, and then you cut them out with scissors. It's super not high tech and very inexpensive, hopefully, for most people. And you take your gauge and you place it right where the kick begins, and you try and match the curve as best you can. So these are in 1-inch increments, so this isn't going to be super precise, but it's going to be close enough because the variation in radii is not very large between, like here's 5 and 6. They're going to look and feel fairly similar. Obviously, if you're a more advanced skater, you probably will feel a difference, but at least it's a very helpful starting point. So I'm just kind of going down the line here, and it looks like 7 matches pretty closely. And you can see if I grab one that's definitely too big, like the R11, there's a little bit of a gap. You actually probably can't see it, but there's basically a gap right here in the center of the arc here. And then on the ones that are too small, like the R3, there's a gap on either side. So you're basically looking for full contact of the board, at least until it goes up to the point where it goes straight out. The bigger your kick radius is, the mellower your board's going to feel, and the smaller your pop angle will be. So a bigger radius mellows out the board. A smaller radius makes it feel tighter. And this is another area where you might see some variation with other boards. Some boards have progressive kicks, where instead of a radius to a straight angle, the board just progressively curves up and there's never actually a straight portion of the wood. And that is, you can get pretty close matching a board shape with the radius and angle, but just keep in mind that there are other ways boards can be shaped. So, and yeah, we'll just leave it at that for now. So we've got the kicks defined now. Next we have the kick gap. The kick gap is the distance from the outermost truck holes to the beginning of the kick, or the kick radius, so where the board starts to curve. Paul Schmidt, who is the well-known skateboard designer and manufacturer, also refers to this area as the fingers of flat area, and he usually says 2 fingers of flat is kind of like the ideal distance between the centers of the truck holes and where the board starts to bend up. And of course you can have different preferences based on how you skate, but that is definitely a very helpful starting point, and that's usually about 1 inch. So 1 inch is a good default value for kick gap, and you can generally get away with down to like a 1/2 inch kick gap and up to about a 1.5 inch kick gap before the board starts to feel a little off and strange. So the kick gap on this board is going to be 1 inch. We've got 1 inch of basically solid flat before it starts to go, and or maybe a little bit less because it's a little gradual. Sometimes the wood does relax a little bit, so if you press it and then it'll relax and curve out and mellow out this curve a little bit. That's actually the case with the kick radius. The kick radius definitely mellowed out here from the originally designed kick, at least with the method of building a board that I use, which is the vacuum bagging method, the row rocket method. And I've even seen some hydraulically pressed boards. I had another board I was measuring earlier that was hydraulically pressed in a 40-ton press, and that also had mellowed out from the originally designed radius a little bit. Or it depends on if you press multiple boards at once. The bigger your kick radius is, the bigger your kick gap will feel, because that curve, that radius, as it comes out, it's going to basically feel flat for a little bit if it's a really big radius. So in short, 1 inch is a good value to choose for your kick gap, and it's just about how much flat space is between center of the truckles, outer truckles, and the beginning of your kick. Okay, the last couple parameters here, we have nose taper point and tail taper point. The taper points are the points at which from the nose or the tail, depending on whether you're measuring the nose or tail taper point. So I got the tail here, and it's the distance from the tip of the tail to where the curved profile finally becomes parallel with the profile on the other side. So when the board finally reaches its full width, it's really what I meant to say. So you measure this just like you do the nose and tail length. So you measure straight out, grab your straight edge, or before I do that, before I measure anything, I should really find where the maximum width is, or where the maximum width starts to taper inward, which is about right here. If I measure this, it's about 8 inches is the taper point for this board. So it's the tail taper point for this board. So that's bigger than the actual tail length. If you make the taper point less than the tail length, the shape looks a little off. Most boards have a taper point in line with the outermost truck holes, or even an inch or two in. But I don't recommend making the taper point smaller than your nose or tail length. So don't make your tail taper point smaller than your tail length. I mean, you can, but I just don't recommend it right now. And this basically just affects the shape of the board. And by that, I mean the profile, the top shape of the board. And lastly, we have the nose and tail shape. This right now is set up as a scale between 50 and 100. 100 is going to make a nose or tail shape that's really blunted and squared off. And the smaller that number is, the more pointed your nose and tail becomes. What these really control are spline control points, or Bezier control points, Bezier curve control points, which is just the type of curve that's used to create this actual shape. You don't need to know that. The simple thing is just you want a blunter nose or tail, increase that number. If you want it pointier, decrease that number. There's also the wheel cutout parameters, as they're called, and those basically add in some control points, so you can tweak how the nose and tail are shaped. So you can pinch it in a little bit, you can bring it out. That helps with some old school shapes, shovel noses, dancer shapes where you might want to have like a nose that's narrow and then the board comes out. So those are those parameters, and the best thing to do is check out the SkateCAD cookbook if you want to get an idea for how to tweak those to make a board that you want. I hope this was helpful. I have been asked about this a few times. I apologize for the delay, but thank you for watching, and have fun measuring your board, and I hope you learned some information about what you like and how to customize your boards in the future to help you skate even better than you do now.